Live and uncensored.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of Litopia After Dark. I'm Ian Wynn, the techno-pagan octopus messiah. I'll be your host tonight alongside a super agent and a super producer, Mr. Peter Cox. And I've got a question. Are you a high-flying banker and or club goer who's recently snorted a line of cocaine? Have you either medicinally or recreationally smoked a joint lately, which, even while legal in some states, is still a violation of federal law? Or hey, maybe you're just addicted to crystal meth, a drug which has a 97% recidivism rate, which is worse than tobacco and heroin. Heck, maybe you're a junkie. Whatever the case, most drugs in the United States nowadays still come across its 1,954-mile border with Mexico, a country whose illegal narcotics trade has claimed upward of, get this, 70,000 lives in the last 10 years. Is this a war on drugs? Or does this amount to nothing less than Mexican Civil War?
Intelligent listening for dangerous minds.
This is Litopia.
Litopia After Dark. After Dark.
Tonight, we're joined by one of the world's foremost experts on the subject, journalist, writer, and TV producer, Mr. Ioan Grillo, who's been covering Latin America for the likes of Time, CNN, Reuters, Al Jazeera, English, oh God, this list goes on forever, the Sunday Telegraph, and the Sunday Times. His award-winning book, El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency, was called by esteemed broadcaster Dan Rather, one of our previous guests.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't mind saying.
Yeah, that's right.
Riveting, authoritative reporting from the front lines of the Mexican drug war. Okay, but here's the crazy part, folks. Ioan Grillo, actually, he's from Brighton.
He's from Brighton. I can't believe it.
No, for those of you who don't know,
he's from Brighton.
Brighton is a quaint English seaside town, about 45-minute train ride from our comfortable studio here in London.
Yeah.
There's a pier there. There's a Ferris wheel. You can buy cotton candy, which over here they call candy floss.
Candy floss, well done.
On the boardwalk.
My word, your vocabulary really is improving.
Thank you.
It?
There's plenty of hipster cafes, antique shops, as well as a vocal and thriving gay scene. In short, it's the exact fucking opposite to northern Mexico, where narcotraficantes dump bags of severed heads on a nightclub floor simply to outdo the rival cartel. The obvious first question is, how did a jolly English lad like Ioan end up in northern Mexico, or Mexico City, where he's joining us tonight? But my first question is, how are you still alive?
I came to Mexico in the year 2000, and I spent a bit of time traveling in other parts of the world before, around the Middle East and Europe, and was very fascinated by Latin America and wanted to just do international journalism. I was a bit, fascinated, or saw the glamour of some of the movies about correspondents covering the civil wars in Central America in the 80s. Films like Salvador, Oliver Stone's film, and had this kind of seemed a kind of romantic idea to me. But one thing, when I arrived in Mexico, it was the year 2000, and the narrative, the dominant narrative was that no, all that's finished now. There's no more civil wars. There's no more military dictatorships. There's no more communist guerrillas. It's all the end of history, and it's all going to be rolling capitalism, and everyone happy. And
so you said yourself, but I love the senoritas. I love tortillas. I've got to stay here. And thankfully, the drug war came along, and you were like, great, I'll stay.
Well, I was saying one of the things that happened when I first arrived, I was very interested straight away about the issue of the drug trade. And partly, as you're saying, that Brighton is the exact opposite of Mexico. There's so many things linking places around the world, and one of them big ones is drugs. And it was very interesting for me, coming from a community with massive drug use, where there is in Brighton, where I went to a school with a lot of people using drugs. Grew up in an area with a lot of young teenagers using drugs, and saw people I knew die of heroin overdoses when I was growing up, and people then moving on. A lot of other people taking drugs and going on to get good jobs and whatever. But to seeing that from a place where drugs were an enormous part of my teenage years, of that feeling like a lot of people have, where when you 15, 16, 17 and drugs. There's big presence around everybody. But a kind of real absence of thinking about where those come from. What don't really think, people smoke hashish, people snort cocaine. Not really much sense of this whole chain of where that's come from, all these people that it's passed through. And when I arrived in Mexico, it was very interesting to me to see that, to arrive in a country of production of drugs and traffic of drugs, and to feel that link in the drug trade. And it was this big mystery, this big riddle, in a way, the drug trade here, or El Narco, as it's called generally. El Narco is the big collective name for the drug trade in Mexico, El Narco.
That incorporates the people who are fighting the drug war, the people who are the narcotraficantes, the mafia leaders, the drugs themselves. It's all under the blanket of El Narco.
Yes, it's a very interesting word and term. It's this kind of quite, in a way, people think El Narco, the narco. So it's a singular proper noun, which people use in Spanish, this kind of big presence. And the way it's said, and used to describe so many different concepts, from gang members on a street carrying out killings, to people trafficking drugs, to lawyers. This whole is sort of, in a way, incorporating also even the war on drugs can almost get bored with this concept. So it's kind of big concept, but it's also it's so present, and during the recent years, it's been so obviously overwhelmingly present in Mexico and plunging the country into this enormous violence. But at the same time, it's like a kind of ghost, or the figures are like ghosts.
It sounds a lot like the way we use the word politics. Like people go, politics.
Yeah, it is. And there's certain things, when I started getting down to writing the book, and when I was trying to find, I spent years reporting on this issue and seeing this, say, from arriving in 2000 to the end of that decade, to 2010 to now 2013, seeing this more from an interesting, fascinating story to a tragic story, with the 70,000 dead, with 25,000 disappeared, to go around and see the horror of a war zone and many crimes similar to the ones I thought about in El Salvador in the 1980s, to see mass graves with more than 200 corpses, to cover massacres with 72 victims, to arrive at scenes with 49 dead people, all of them decapitated, and their hands and their feet chopped off.
Are these 70,000, are they all intimately related to or fighting the drugs trade? Or, I mean, how much civilian casualties, how many, reporters and politicians and that sort of thing get caught in the crossfire?
A very large amount. The problem with this violence in Mexico is that, obviously there's an enormous fog of war, like in many situations, but particularly they say about the drug war, as well as one journalist wrote in a book a few years ago, is smoke and mirrors. It's all of, it creates even more confusion as well, the whole creation of a drug war construct. So, it's very, and Mexico as well is a particularly conspiratorial country.
So what do you have to do to be targeted and killed? Like, what is the simplest offense? Obviously, you look at somebody the wrong way. That's true all over the world. But
yeah, well, I'll give you some real examples of some people, some very tragic deaths in this. I mean, there's many. I mean, from crime scenes I've been to where the killers have gone after a target in one car and sprayed 500 bullets with AK-47 assault rifles. 500 bullets.
Did they get the right car?
Yeah, mostly bought in, and they've got the victim and they've got the car behind and the guy selling tacos on the side of the street. So they've all been brought up in that massacre. Cover stories or an interview. One guy who was in fixing his car in a car mechanics shop with his younger brother. He went, a regular day, went to fix the car. There was some problem with the brakes. He was with his 16-year-old younger brother. He was a guy in his early 20s. And this mechanic shop, it turned out, was connected to a drug trafficker. And a rival drug trafficker attacked the car shop, the mechanic shop, to hit the economic assets of his rival. So he went in there and he gunned down 9 people in there.
Who had nothing to do with anything other than they were kicking up some of their profits to the rival cartel next door.
Or the customers would get killed. Now, in this particular case, a 16-year-old kid, this guy's younger brother, was shot dead. This guy was underneath the car. The guy I talked to was in his early 20s, was underneath the car, so he survived by being underneath the car when everyone was getting shot, including his brother. He just heard the firing. 2 bullets went into his leg, but he didn't move. and he was lying there. And then the guys were walking around the mechanic shops looking for any survivors. And he was thinking, my God, if they see me, they're going to kill me. And then one of them dropped an ammunition clip, and he thought if he picks that up, he's going to see me under the car and kill me. And then the guy thought, oh, my God, my mobile phone, if somebody calls me now,
oh, man,
they're going to kill me. And they didn't. The phone didn't sound. They walked out, and he got out of, still with 2 bullets in his leg, but he was so full of adrenaline he couldn't even feel them. Got out, stumbled onto a street, and survived. And as walking down, and survived, and obviously he lost his brother. He called his mother, saying, "Oh, he's gone."
It seems to me that whenever somebody sticks their head above the parapets, whether they're a new police chief or a new politician or a reporter such as yourself, and they go, "Hey, this is crazy going on here," they're cut down very quickly. I can't remember her name. There was a woman who became a police chief in one of the border towns, and she was like, "We're going to put a stop to this. At least we're going to stop the killing of innocent civilians." And she was dead within a month.
It's covering a very violent, complicated situation in Mexico. At the same time, to try and keep a perspective on what it actually feels like covering this. So you have had 70,000 people killed in recent years. In some years, it was actually the most violent armed conflict in the world before Syria really started off and became more violent than Mexico, as a big armed conflict. But still, Mexico's a big country, and still it's not as a high-intensity armed conflict as many that have been around the world, in human history.
It's not a declared war.
It's still a low-intensity, armed conflict. And there's still all kinds of people moving around and reporting on this. There's still been a great, heroic job by much of the Mexican press in reporting and trying to keep shining a light on this. And
Mexican press and international press has been targeted. I mean, they're
yeah, of course, yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to ask you, what's the most grotesque, I suppose, piece of violence that you have personally seen?
Well, I would say, I've arrived at many crime scenes covering this, and in one of the early days here, trying to find my way into this situation was going to just the many crime scenes, doing what they call the police beat here, or the La Nota Roja, they call it the red note. So I arrived at crime scenes with heads, decapitated heads. I've arrived in many crime scenes with bodies, all over, with their heads have been blown apart, brains have been blown apart, and arrived at one which I mentioned earlier with the 49. I went to the mortuary where they had the 49 bodies who'd had their heads, hands, and feet chopped off.
Jesus.
As well as that, obviously, at certain times I've been on scenes where there's been gunfire happening and seen victims being killed, or gunfire happening around a place.
The point of this violence is to outdo the other side, isn't it? It's to send a message, isn't it?
Well, I think to try and decode some of the violence, and as well as go to these crime scenes, like I said, in the journey I took to try and understand this phenomenon of drug trafficking, I also got to talk to drug cartel operatives, to traffickers, to assassins, and talk to them about how they committed this violence, and talk to people who described to me chopping people's heads off while they're still alive and that kind of thing. Mm. And that's even more disturbing than seeing the bodies on the ground. Is almost hearing, obviously talking to the family members of victims is obviously very disturbing. When you see the mothers crying, the family members crying, that really sinks in. But also talking to the people who carry this out.
Let me just ask you, how dangerous is it for you on the ground?
Well, it's obviously there's dangers involved covering this, like there is covering any armed conflict. Like I was saying, there are a lot of people covering this, especially Mexican reporters. It's not like I'm the only person out there. Yeah. There's a lot of Mexican reporters who have done more aggressive reporting, have been more, have pointed more fingers. A lot of the reporting I've done, whereas I do try and get very deep into this issue, I don't really try to get involved at pointing fingers at particular politicians or getting involved in kind of battles, because I feel what I can try and do better is try and get to the big picture of this, of what it means and the human stories, and get that to an international audience.
This is Roger Scruton. You can hear me on The Gary Bushell Show here on our wonderful Radio Litopia.
Here comes the future.
When you think cocaine, you think Colombia and Bolivia. When you think, heroin and opium, you think the golden triangle of Southeast Asia. When you think crystal meth, you think American trailer parks, really. But now all of it is coming through Mexico. Mexico it's taken over the Colombian trade, even in cocaine. They used to just, according to your book, they used to just traffic it, where the Colombians would bring the coke up to the border and then say, okay, have at it. But now the Mexicans are bringing it all the way up from Colombia. How did Mexico become the number one supplier of all narcotics?
Well, if you look at the Mexican drug trade, we can take the story all the way back to the early 20th century, to one year in particular, 1914. And 1914, as many of you might know, is the year of the Harrison's Narcotics Tax Act, which first created a black market, created prohibition or regulation rather of opium, and created a black market in opium. And at that very time, all the way 100 years ago, you had some opium being grown in Sinaloa state in Mexico. And Sinaloa, in some ways, is to the Mexican drug cartels as Sicily is to the Italian mafia. It's the kind of cradle of organized crime in Mexico. You'd had Chinese workers who'd come to Mexico then to work on railroads and in mines, and they'd taken opium poppies with them and started growing it and started smoking opium. So you already had this kind of quite a kind of rough state in Mexico growing opium when it was illegal in the United States, or when it was prohibited in the United States to a certain extent. And a black market was they started smuggling that over. So you already began to get the networks of drug trafficking, drug smuggling from all the way back then. You have a long history of drug trafficking in Mexico, starting with the opium. Then in the 1960s, when there was a massive demand of marijuana in the United States, it spread across Mexico, like bushfire from Sinaloa right to the south, and you had a massive production of marijuana.
Now, is that a direct result of U.S. drug policy against marijuana?
It was a massive result of the U.S. demanding marijuana going through the roof, and there being an illegal market again, at that time where, Richard Nixon was, the tapes show that Richard Nixon at that time was saying that marijuana was turning people into communists and, and so forth. That was, he was the communists using it as a conspiracy to mess people up and so forth. So you had the beginning of the war on drugs in the US, and at the same time, marijuana spreading through Mexico in a massive way. A lot of the time, back then, if you look at some of the early testimonies of US traffickers, US marijuana sellers, they would fly to Mexico and look and buy massive amounts and take it to the US, and so create this massive demand. Go in there saying,
so the farmers in Sinaloa were like, "Oh, cha-ching! This is fantastic. We can grow this plant that grows just as easily as tomatoes for our British listeners, and they'll pay us way more. They'll pay us dollars on the penny."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there was some testimonies in the book as well about from marijuana farmers from back then in states like Guerrero. I mean, it went from Sinaloa, like I say, went right down and spread across large parts of Mexico, and these farmers down there, when suddenly it was like a massive demand of marijuana, and these people didn't have, again, it's this fine interest in this connection between worlds. These people, it was the time of the summer of love. It was the time of Sergeant Pepper being number one in the Billboard charts.
See in the sky with diamonds, yo.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. And at the same time, these guys had no concept of that. These people in rough families in the mountains of southern Mexico. But it was just a product. It was just money coming. Grow this plant. You can make a bunch of money that way. So you saw this creation of big networks again of the drug trade spreading across large amounts of Mexico. Then in the 70s, when the cocaine boom happened, and there's obviously a very fascinating history about cocaine and about that was the all-American drug in its time, and how the winners of the Super Bowl were like the winners of the Super Bowl. Were all snorting cocaine before going out to play, and the whole disco explosion. And this cocaine created this enormous amounts of money. I mean, the amount of money in cocaine was then and is still mind-boggling.
Oh, the amount of like new banks and car dealerships that sprung up in Miami during the early 80s is just ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I say one of the great marketing things about cocaine is like cocaine is really not that great a drug. It really is nothing that special. It gives people a high for a certain time, but
No, it's brilliant because all you really want from cocaine is more.
But it's such a glamorous image to create about cocaine that it suddenly creates a real value that people were prepared to pay in the early days, $150 for a gram of this stuff. And people still, in the UK will pay 60, 70 pounds. I've been living outside the UK for a long time, so whatever exactly they pay there right now. But for a gram of this substance, which really is nothing that special, but the amount of money this all led to, cocaine was billions upon billions upon billions of dollars.
So what has that done? What has that done to the Mexican economy?
Yeah, so if you look at cocaine now over the last 40 years and the effect of it on Latin America generally, it's been devastating in terms of the amount of money it's brought in, but the amount of bad money it's brought in, the money that's gone to the wrong people, money that's gone to create armies of killers, money that's gone to corrupt politicians, money that's gone to buy off policemen.
And money that's gone to arm the different rival cartels so that they can fight with each other.
Exactly. So if you just go step back a little bit about how this got into Mexico.
Yeah.
The cocaine was going right from Colombia to Florida, and they could just fly right across. If you look on a map there, you can see a straight line from Colombia, from the Colombian Caribbean coast to Miami. Then the US, in the early 80s under Ronald Reagan, they figured out, okay, we can quite easily block this, create a choke point in the Caribbean.
So they hired Crockett and Tubbs.
Yeah, exactly. Got
from Miami Vice, put them in some pastel suits and said, go get them, boys. And that pretty much solved that problem, yeah?
Yeah, as well as Crockett and Tubbs, they had you get a few naval vessels, you get radar, but it's quite a thin line to control. Unlike the US border, which, as you mentioned, is almost 2,000 miles long. So then when the Colombians realized, okay, we're losing too much product here, they're stopping it. There's a guy who's in fact a Honduran guy called Mata Ballesteros, who was the link between the Colombians and the Mexicans at the beginning. He said to them, okay, look, I know the guys in Mexico, I know you guys in Colombia. How about we make a deal here and we will bounce? And that's the phrase that we'll use the Mexican trampoline to bounce the cocaine into the United States. So Mexico's already got extensive trafficking networks in opium, heroin, and marijuana. Just move the cocaine through there.
They're also dead poor at this time, so there are plenty of willing bodies to be mules or to fly planes or to drive trucks and pick it up on both sides of the border to take those risks to feed their families. Yeah,
exactly. So suddenly you bounce through and suddenly you get this massive network in Mexico of all the cocaine. Then, like you said, it starts off as being, or I think you mentioned this earlier, it's the Colombians start off as the Mexicans start off as the paid couriers, the Colombians, where they're being paid for every kilo or for every ton they're moving, they're getting paid a set fee. But gradually, the Colombians, who then, in the 90s, you start getting this real attack on the Colombian traffickers, especially Pablo Escobar. You had this brief period when the Cold War finished.
Well, we like a figurehead. We like an Osama bin Laden. We like when there's a whole network when we can hang, especially as Americans, when we can hang we can turn it into a cult of personality. And Pablo Escobar, he had fucking hippos. I mean, this guy was a personality. Say what you will about, and he was extremely benevolent to the area that he came from. They still hail him as a saint back in the hills where he was that near Bogota? I forget.
He's from Medellin.
Medellin, yeah.
Pablo Escobar, he was a massive personality.
At least 15 stone.
One of his best quotes he's supposed to have said is, "Cocaine is my atomic bomb to drop on the Americans." Like, he kind of describe himself as being like, okay, I'm really fighting the Americans with cocaine.
Well, that's the same logic that's used by Al Qaeda in the sense that we'll ship lots of heroin over from Afghanistan and we'll poison the enemy.
Sure. Right.
So
yeah, exactly. So you can justify it or whatever in the whole twisted thing. But another thing that Pablo Escobar, as well as being a big personality and being a benevolent warlord, like you said, supplying charity houses for poor people in Medellin, he also was a big threat to the Colombian government. I mean, he blew up an airliner one time. He paid some guerrillas to attack the parliament. He kidnapped loads of people. So he became a very violent threat. So they started, after the Cold War finished, and the Pentagon and the CIA were like, before they really got a grip on Islamic terrorists, they were like thinking, or Islamic militants, they were thinking, okay, we got what other enemies around? And Pablo Escobar came up, there was a big, for once, the DEA, the FBI, the CIA, the Pentagon, the Colombian police, Colombian gangsters all worked together and brought Pablo Escobar down, killed him in 93.
Unlike other leaders, unlike we mentioned Osama bin Laden, they actually took the bear photo. And the bear photo being when they get the guy, they have all the paramilitary, all the special forces dudes who took him out. They posed him dead with their feet on him. And so everybody got to see that Pablo Escobar was dead. Whereas, and I think people were calling for that for bin Laden. They're like, where's the bear photo? Where's the trophy photo? But Pablo Escobar was one of the biggest bears that was brought down during that time. And I just to fast forward a little bit, because there's so much I'd like to discuss with you. Essentially, at that point, the United States started funding massive paramilitary interaction or started funding the Colombian military to shut down the cartels in Colombia. At this point, I mean, I don't even know the numbers, but millions and millions of dollars were funneled into weapons, and they got tons of helicopters, and suddenly the heat is on in Colombia. So at that point, as I understand it, the Colombians say, actually, Mexico, can you guys like come down here and pick it up? Like, we used to bring it up to you guys. If you could maybe swing by in the pickup and drive it up and take it from here.
Yeah, that's definitely part of the story. So what happened was, if you look at the economy of cocaine, which is fascinating when you get into it, you can sell a kilo of cocaine for about $2,000 in Colombia, whereas if you sell it at wholesale in the US, it's about $30,000. And on the streets, it can be worth $150,000. So it's an enormous markup.
Well, that depends on how much you step on it, but okay.
Yeah, exactly. Even if you go back down, even before taking it down to how much the leaves cost from the farmers, it's about $80. So it's a kind of business that anybody who gets in it makes a lot of money, but very, very fast, which is why everyone wants to be in this business.
This is why they write songs about it.
Yeah, and why you put in $1,000 and suddenly you make $50,000 back very fast. Then you put in the $50,000 and you make $1 million fast. So you can see why the violence has got so big. But you're right. As the Colombians start saying, "Well, look, we've got too much heat now. We're getting bust. We can just sell a bunch of this stuff to the Mexicans now. They can move it. So sell it for $2,000 here." But also the Colombians saw, look, we've got a European market, which is great. We can sell this stuff. The European market's going great in the UK, in Spain, in Italy, which is the biggest three, but also right across the whole European continent. So we can make a bunch of money there as well. So whatever, we can unload it to the Mexicans. So in Mexicans, you get the cocaine money, then adding to this, and also the crystal meth money, which is, again, another story. Obviously, crystal meth, as you mentioned, trailer parks, I think. And
the amazing thing about crystal meth, and you talked about losing friends to heroin. I've lost a couple of very close friends to crystal meth, not in the sense that they died, but in the sense that they're the walking dead. And when people become addicted, there's a 97% recidivism rate. If you try to kick it, you have a very slim chance of if you're injecting it, like, it's kind of over. And people get hooked on it. But the thing that kind of fascinates me is why Mexico if you can make it in your bathtub?
Yeah, what happened in the US was first they started in 2005. They banned a bunch of the precursors in the US. So when they banned those, people started moving them into Mexico a lot, bringing them from all around the world. But also in Mexico, they started making these super labs. So rather than like in a bathtub, they had like industrial, big industrial places for churning out crystal meth, much cheaper.
So this is Walter White Breaking Bad territory.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are, I've been to some of these labs they bust in Mexico. You can see this quite funny, amazing technology, crafted up boilers and machines they use for making crystal meth here.
Well, interestingly, as I understand it, that's technology that they got from Southeast Asian, from the Chinese, who had a much, or from Hong Kong anyway, from they had a drug called shabu, which is essentially industrial grade methamphetamine that they would process, and it would have this amazing amount of purity, and they would sell in these little figurines.
Yeah, I don't know about the implications of technology. What I do know is that there was a lot of the precursors were coming from Asia.
There we are.
And one of the big figures who was accused of bringing precursors over was a Chinese guy born in China who actually got nationalized Mexican called Shenli Yigong.
Yeah.
He was then caught in his house in Mexico City. They found cash $207 million.
What?
That's like the biggest cash seizure ever in the history of ever.
Exactly. This guy then ran. He was going up to Las Vegas a lot. This guy from bouncing between Mexico and Las Vegas.
Because if you got 207 million lying around the house, fuck it, man. Throw $100,000 on the craps tables. What's it gonna matter?
It wasn't $100,000. It was more like 100 million. I mean, he was putting incredible amounts of money into. He was going up to Las Vegas with suitcases of money. Well, he didn't really have the same money laundering techniques. A lot of the Mexicans.
That doesn't sound like any technique.
Yeah,
It doesn't, does it?
It did work because you go into a casino, you throw in millions of dollars, and they were giving back.
Yeah, and you get the chips. That's old hat. But you're like, come on, you've arrived with suitcases of cash, and then you like leave with suitcases of chips, and then cash them out. This does not sound like a plan that's going to work more than once.
Well, the guy's still around, and he's still going, so it's kind of working.
Unbelievable.
He's in the US right now fighting extradition to Mexico, so it's a crazy story. Shane Lee, but anyway, going back to what you mentioned earlier about what's this money done or what does this money mean in Mexico. They think no one knows the real quantities of money involved in this because it's a clandestine industry. But there's estimates that it could be about $30 billion every year going into Mexico from selling drugs to the United States. Now, if you think about $30 billion a year, in 10 years, that's $300 billion. In 20, 600, 30 years, talking about nearly $1 trillion.
So are you suggesting a way to fix the banking crisis through selling cocaine?
The thing, if you look at Mexico, really Mexico is not a poor country. Mexico is a middle-income country with some incredibly rich people, some very big things, and a lot of poor people as well. But in terms of the whole Mexican economy, the drugs are the drug sales to the United States are maybe 3%, so it's not that significant. But in certain communities, it has an enormous effect.
Yes. Especially because the violence is concentrated in northern Mexico. If you go to Cancun, you think, what's the problem? I mean, drugs are available. The police are cool. Like there's drunken college kids on the beach. It's spring break. How is all this happening along the borderline? And I think a lot of times people they turn Mexico into one thing when it's actually the violence is happening on a very thin strip along the border.
Yeah, I mean, it's gone a bit beyond the border now, but it's certainly Mexico's a very big country with 118 million people, and large amounts of Mexico are fine. Yucatan state's got the same homicide rate as Belgium. The Cancun strip, all the way down from Cancun to Tulum, is very protected, and that's worth tens of billions of dollars in
tourist dollars, sure.
But anyway, the drug money has an enormous effect in certain communities. An incredibly bad effect of paying for many young people, a generation of young people, to become paid assassins. And if you go into some of these neighborhoods, and I've been to these places and interviewed many of these young people who have been recruited as assassins for drug cartels, sometimes at 13, 14 years old when they first get bought in.
Now, if I'm 13 or 14 years old and I want to get in the trade, and they go, look, well, you got to go kill some people before you get on the ladder. How much do I get for getting on a motorbike and going up to some random car and shooting some guy in the head?
This is very sad to say, but the payments that they were often giving now to kill people in Ciudad Juarez is 1,000 Mexican pesos, which is about $85 or about 50 pounds.
So for 50 quid, $85, I can get someone killed in Ciudad Juarez?
That's right, yeah. That's sad.
As a gringo, I'm probably not going to get the local price. I'll probably get the tourist price, which will be but for $150, that's crazy.
Yeah, that's very sad, and that shows a real social degradation. But then you've got to see why or how is it that people can sell themselves so cheap and commit these horrific crimes. And one thing that when I've done this investigation and gone into the prisons and gone on the streets to talk to people and interviewed many killers, and the weird thing is that many of them, when you talk to them on a personal level, they can be, and it sounds fun to say, they can be nice people, they can be people who don't seem to be psychotic, they can be people who seem quite ordinary in some other senses.
Because we tend to think as people who are stone cold killers as being psychopaths, having something broken in their amygdala and such. But poverty has driven people to where they go, well,
Is it poverty? Is it poverty or is it just greed?
I think it's a mix of things. I think one very important thing to understand the murder business in Latin America and how come the 1 in every 3 murders committed around the world is committed in Latin America. It is these machines of death. And it is when young people you get machines which train young people to become killers, which bring them in with the whole institutional things in a way around you, so that you get bought in very quickly. Because a lot of these young people, it's not the first thing they do is kill. Often they'll be living in a neighborhood, and the governments, the states have failed these neighborhoods, have failed these young people. They haven't come to offer them anything. So they're in a neighborhood. A lot of the time in Ciudad Juarez, for example, we mentioned, you had a massive explosion of ghettos there for people who were working in factories created in the 90s and early 2000s to build things off of the American market, off the world market, and the Maquila program, assembly plants. And people come as immigrants from all over Mexico to work in these factories.
They pay people like 50 cents an hour in the maquiladoras making mops for the 99-cent stores in the United States.
Exactly, yes. So often, another thing there was they often prefer female workers than male workers. They could do the work just as well, and there'd be less problems than the male workers. So often you got the women being the breadwinners.
So it's a Latin American country with macho is in fact, I don't know if it's a Mexican.
Yeah, it is Mexican.
It is Mexican. It's not Spanish. You have machismo, and you're going to make the women the sole breadwinners, so the guys are suddenly feeling slightly emasculated, and, well, why not be contract killers for $50? I mean, come on. This is crazy.
But also the children growing up, it's often the children of these factory workers. So they're growing up in a place. Their parents are immigrants from the countryside. They've ended up being broken homes, like I say, because often the services have created single working mothers, and then them being on a street by themselves in a ghetto where there's no street lights, where there's no paved road, where they're in a funny place where they're watching. You put the TV on there and you see American TV, where you're kind of in a weird kind of between worlds in this place with drugs moving through, with guns moving through. And then the first thing, the government's not coming to these people and saying to them, what do you want to do with your life? Let's get you in school. So the first thing people do is join a street gang. And then by doing a street gang, they have some kind of protection on the street. And then the cartels go to them and say, okay, look, you can work for us. And the first thing we have to do is stand on a street corner with a telephone. I'm going to give you a mobile phone, and I'm going to give you $50 a week to stand on a corner, and any car that goes past, you just tell me the plates, tell me who it is. You become a spy.
You become a corner boy. This is the same sort of model that goes on in the inner cities of the United States. Then they move up from to selling dime bags in small amounts, and they slowly work their way up the ladder.
And then some of these times they say, okay, as you're 16, you can become a killer at 16 or 14 or 17, and also that means you can't do much time inside.
That's right, because then you're going to end up in the juvenile system, and you'll get out in a couple of years. Whereas if you're over 18 committing a murder, then you're going to get locked up for a good long time.
Hello, I'm Eric Beck-Rubin, hardcore out-of-control book enthusiast, inviting you to listen to a new show here on Litopia called Burning Books. Every 3 weeks, we put out a new podcast on a single book. It could be a recent debut, a classic, fiction, nonfiction, and everything in between. The idea is to explore what lies at the heart of great books, books that try to be great but don't quite make it, as well as, now and then, books that are irredeemably bad. So check out our archive shows on Litopia, and we'll look forward to having you join us for our next podcast.
I'm just going to very quickly go through the past three presidents of Mexico and their drugs policy. The PRI was, which stands for what, the People's Revolution.
In Spanish, it's the Institutional Revolutionary Party.
There we are. That's why I get it confused. But it's PRI in the English-speaking world, and they had a lock on power for 70 years, which was broken in 2000 by a man named Vicente Fox. Vicente Fox he didn't really mess with the cartels. There wasn't so much violence. But some people say that's because he was in bed with certain cartels, and the drugs were continuing to move, and it was just one. The one franchise was doing it all. Then along came possibly my favorite Mexican president, Felipe Calderon. He came into power in 2006, and he basically said, "It's on. We are going to go and break some spines. We are going to take out we're going to fight the drug war. We're going to get help from the United States." And he basically went on a spree, getting the army involved. And what that did, as far as I understand it, it splintered the cartels to all these different factions that ended up fighting one another. And then after all that, this is when in 2010 was most bloodiest year of the drug war in Mexico, when 15,000 people died. And he was recently appointed a sort of a cherry one-off teaching position at Harvard University, where, according to the news agency Agence France Presse, admitted that I love this. This is the most brilliant mea culpa for 30,000 people who've died in your tenure because you've decided to go all in the war on drugs. He admitted that his administration failed in clearly communicating his security policy toward drug cartels. And so now he's teaching at Harvard. So the question I want to ask you is, suddenly the PRI has come back into power with the election of Enrique Peña Nieto in 2012. He promised to quell the drug violence, but does that mean he's getting back into bed with the drug lords? What do you think the current Mexican policy is?
Yeah, sure. If I could just take it back from what you were saying a bit, which is very interesting, how you're discussing the last three presidents. I would say, to understand about what's happened in Mexico and the level of violence, I think you look at throughout the 20th century, for 71 years, you had the PRI, which is actually the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the institution.
Gracias, señor.
Which is ruled from 1929 to 2000 consistently. They run everything. They had every single president for 71 years. They ran every single governor for a lot of that time. They ran the whole of Congress and so forth. So it was one party which has been compared to the Communist Party in the Soviet Union for its grip on power, not for its politics, but for its grip on power. They are ideologically nebulous. They came out of the Mexican Revolution, but they became very kind of centrist, and they had some people who were big capitalist, free market people, other people who are more center-left in their ranks.
So pretty much within living memory up until 2000, if you had any kind of gripe with the government, you had it with the PRI.
Exactly. But the PRI ran the country, and they could have a control. It was not democracy. The elections were fixed in many of the cases. There was no real transparency about what the army, what the police were doing. But one thing is, they could control organized crime. And this is part of the real big picture, I think.
When you say control, do you mean control, or do you mean like work together with?
Yeah, I think both.
Again, don't stick your head above the parapets and get blown off. Certainly not before we finish the interview.
There's been places that have been tried of Mexican officials during that time of being convicted of working with drug cartels. They're known to hide there. But also, there was corruption, but you could control it as well. You could arrest and keep in line the cartels. Now, when you had this great democracy happening with Vicente Fox, who was a former executive from Coca-Cola, and he came, this very straight, frank-speaking guy, and you had this great vision of democracy. How great democracy arrived.
Have a Coke and a smile.
The state becoming weak was a very sad side effect of democracy. So suddenly, the system of corruption began to break down. There was still corruption in the years after, in the two presidents after the PRI, but it was much more confused about who was working with who. And the drug cartels, with all this cocaine money we've been talking about, these hundreds of billions of dollars that have gone into them, became themselves a real power base. They started to realize, okay, actually, the government's not really that powerful anymore. We're powerful. And they became more like criminal warlords that actually began to threaten the state or overwhelm the state in parts of the country. So when Felipe Calderon declared this war on drug cartels, he didn't realize how weak perhaps the government had got, and how much this just created, sections of the state were still very corrupt, of the army and so forth. So it became just an escalation of violence.
It was during this time that people would join the special forces. They would join the army. They would get their training, and then once they were like all super uber soldiers, they would flip sides.
Well, that's right. And again, it shows this fragmentation of the state. You had, you refer to the Army Special Forces people who trained with the United States in some cases. The elite Mexican military.
But they used to go, what is the School of the Americas or something, which would train people into being elite soldiers and taking out regimes?
It's exactly right. And some of these people who were the elite forces then became mercenaries working for drug cartels. So a fragmentation of the state apparatus. And some crazy stuff happening where you got hitmen from one cartel attacking the federal police and then running away from the attack, getting a punch a tire and calling the local state police to give them a ride away. The hitmen. Or other crazy cases where you had in a prison in one state, and the prison guards letting the prisoners out of the prison at night to cross the state lines go to another state, carry out a massacre, and then go back to prison that night and sleep in their cells. So there's kind of real fragmentation of the state apparatus.
Can I get a pizza with that and like some more yard time?
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, go carry out the hit and then come back for the pizza.
Sorry, that was culturally insensitive. I actually meant tacos.
We do that quite a lot, actually.
Sorry.
Anyway, so they've now come back into power. Part of the reason they came back, or we even voted for them to come back, was them saying, look, it was much better in the days. It might have been corrupt in the days of one-party rule, but we held things together in the same way that in the Soviet Union, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had, certain elements of the old regime coming back into power, saying, we want the old guard back in again because they kept things safer.
Well, the policy under Calderon was just disastrous. I think we can all agree, because they went all in on the war on drugs, and now we're looking at a situation where Uruguay, which is a very small country, they've just in the last few months, or in July or something, they legalized marijuana. They're like, this is ridiculous. At least people can smoke. It's just a drop in the bucket, but it still accounts for anything between $2 and $5 billion dollars in the trade. Meanwhile, Colorado, the states of Colorado and Washington have also legalized marijuana, and it seems that that's the way public opinion is flowing. Let's take the money, at least take the money out of the hands of these violent cartels. Now, interestingly, Vicente Fox, who came into power in 2000, he had this to say. He said that it needs to go back to the people. The money needs to go back to the people and out of the hands of these violent cartels. And what he's talking about is production, and then packaging, and then distribution, and then wholesale, and then retail, just like every other product is sold. And maybe the state gets a tax on that and whatnot, but then suddenly the people are not getting, they're selling their kilo of marijuana for $4 and it sells for $10,000 across the border. And this is Vicente Fox coming out and saying we need to take the whole supply chain and give it back to the people. What do you think? What do you think of that?
I am absolutely in favor of the drug policy reform. I think we're in a historic time right now of the collapse of the war on drugs. I think what Uruguay did, which it was just in fact approved by the Senate.
That's really interesting, because in Uruguay, as I understand it, the people were actually polled and against legalizing marijuana, but the legislature were like, no, actually, we're tired of the violence. And they went through in the lower house and they passed it.
Yeah.
That would never happen here. It would only go the other way. The whole 80% of the public says, we don't want to go to war. And what do? We go to war. In the States, 90% of the people say we want gun control. And what do? Not have gun control. And you go to Uruguay and everybody, but they do it on the other side. They go the other way. The majority of the people say we don't want marijuana legalized. And they're like, no, we know what's best for you. Why can't we get some of that in Mexico and the United States?
I think the dominoes are falling. I think that this is definitely the snowball effect now we're seeing. We started off in Colorado and Washington State. Now we're looking at polls. You mentioned polls in the United States. Now we're seeing a majority of people asked are clearly saying we believe in the legalization of marijuana. So I think we're going to see many. We're talking about California could be a state following.
California could be a state. There are 5,000 dispensaries in Los Angeles alone. Marijuana is de facto legal in California.
So we're getting this crazy thing happening. Now, there's still got to be a lot of changes on the ground. Still, even while in California, like you say, you can go to a doctor and say, I'm stressed. I need some marijuana because I'm stressed. It's a medical condition. Marijuana helps stress. We show that. Give me a certificate and I can get marijuana. But while that's happening, you still got just over the border, you've got marijuana being grown in Mexico, and it being controlled by these crazy drug cartels like the Zetas, moving it to the United States, and that money's still going to pay for killers, to pay for corrupt police, to pay to create this low-intensity war zone in parts of the country. So we've really got to move on in the reality, but I think it is a big moment right now.
Well, here we come back to this. Here we come back to the same argument that always haunts the war on drugs, is people go, look, legalization, it may be a bad thing, and people will, and marijuana is a stepping stone drug, and if you smoke marijuana, you'll probably take psychedelics, and then you'll probably take cocaine, and who knows what, and fair enough, that's what happened to me. But what comes back to is we need to take that money. We're broke. I mean, the United States is in mad debt. So we could at least take it away from people who are certified killers and put it back in the hands of some infrastructure and even give that to treatment programs. But that can't even be discussed. There are people who are so locked into the conservative ideology of all drugs are bad, Nancy Reagan, just say no, that it's just not happening. There doesn't seem to be any way of moving this debate forward. And meanwhile, the bodies continue to pile up.
I think it has. I think it has broken now. I think 2 years ago, it was the case. Everyone was saying, no, it's a non-starter. It was the phrase. I remember even last summer, summer 2012, I was in a TV show, talked to some people, and they talked about the drugs issue, the legalization issue, and someone said, oh, it's a non-starter. And a couple of months after that, they legalized it in Colorado and Washington State. That showed you cannot call it a non-starter anymore.
It's the old Bill Clinton line. It's the economy, stupid. I mean, you could tax marijuana and make some serious bank because even people who are on welfare need to buy weed.
Yeah, certainly do.
Actually, maybe that's not the best argument, but yes.
Many of the debates now, you actually go to, it's funny that in Washington State and Colorado, the prohibitionist lobby really collapsed. It's like, where were they? They really collapsed in their argument. And now often you see the prohibitionists and the kind of drug-free America people complaining, oh, we're not given a fair shake in the media anymore. All you're hearing is people talking about pro-legalization of marijuana now.
Part of that reason is the people who are, for prohibition, they're getting old and dying out. I mean, if you look at the viewing statistics for Fox News, I mean, they skew way over 65. They might as well just be advertising adult nappies and Geritol. Hey, it's a libertarian argument. It's essentially a libertarian argument.
Yeah,
let people do what they want. If I want to smoke coke and if I want to snort coke until I die, that's my right. As long as I don't harm anybody, as long as I don't get behind the wheel and kill children, which is what happens with alcohol every day, as long as I'm not impacting our medical institutions, but what cigarettes are doing and goddamn McDonald's, I mean, you look at all that and you go, well, surely we can have some marijuana on the streets. Surely we can regulate cocaine. Surely we can provide heroin to people who are users and have them, I don't know, sweep the streets or something. I'm just throwing out ideas here.
It's going to happen. It's going to happen. There's no question about that. What I wanted to ask you, Ioan, is what will happen economically when, it effectively drugs become decriminalized? What's going to happen then?
Well, there's a big process is happening, and there's going to be the word decriminalized obviously means that it's still illegal, but people are getting criminal punishments for possession. So that in some ways creates a problem. You legalize the consumption, but you still keep the market illegal.
They allow you to grow a couple of plants, yes?
Well, no, in the decriminalization, if you say, like, I'm not going to punish you, like if you say, okay, like, I no longer arrest you for carrying cocaine, I'll just take it away. You say, okay, it's okay to use cocaine, but the people who produce the cocaine, it's still an illegal market. So I think, one thing is the moving from decriminalization to legalization. We actually say, okay, like they're doing now with marijuana in Uruguay or in Washington State, where they're saying, okay, we're going to give you a license to grow marijuana. We're going to give you a license to sell marijuana.
Whereas, just to clarify, in places like California, they issue permits, but it's still illegal under federal law. So if the DEA had the budget, they would totally go in and enforce it and bust all the 5,000 dispensaries. But it's gotten so big, good luck, Obama.
So we've got a big process happening for a long time. But some of the effects are going to be, so you start to get a legal market in marijuana. Obviously, that kind of brings out a chain of the drug cartels. Think about marijuana, it's very labor intensive. Loads of people get pulled into drug cartels in Mexico because they're growing marijuana in the countryside, because they're trafficking it over the border. 89% of the seizures on the southern border are still marijuana.
80%?
89%. It's crazy.
89% is still marijuana?
Wow. Still marijuana.
See,
if you look at the whole
that
border.
strikes me as just crazy because the shit grows like tomatoes. Sorry. It's really easy to grow. Not that I would know. That's allegedly, I heard from a friend. But it just springs up. It's called weed for a reason.
Yeah, sure. And it's just, But anyway, it was interesting. I said I was at a talk in Mexico, northern Mexico, last year with my book, and a guy came to me and he said, I know a lot of the people who sell drugs, who grow drugs and move drugs, and they're good people. He said, I like that they're respectful. They're better than the army. These are people who traffic drugs, but I like them. I said, but what are we going to do if it becomes legal? What are they going to do? How are they going to make money?
Exactly.
So I think that's the question. So and I've heard this argument voiced by different people from senior police officers to all kinds of people who say, like, the problem is if drugs become legal, what are all these crazy guys are going to do is going to turn completely to kidnapping.
And kidnapping is a massive problem in Mexico.
Kidnapping, extortion, it's a problem that is a big problem now already in Mexico and has to be dealt with in a big way. Why would it be easier for law enforcement people to deal with these problems if it wasn't dealing with the whole drug trade as well? If it was just focusing on kidnapping, extortion.
And that's the thing, victimless crime. We've got to stop putting people in prison, and we've got to stop creating these cartels that get 14-year-olds to get on motorbikes and shoot people in the head for $85. And by getting that out. But here's an interesting point that was brought up to me the other day is even in the states where they've legalized it or decriminalized it or what have you, when 20 years ago, it was $300 an ounce for decent marijuana, again allegedly, so I've heard. Now it's about in the dispensary, it's about the same or more because they're actually developing different strains. It's become like wine. I have a friend who never smoked weed before, and she was like, "Oh no, but I love a blue sativa with from the Kona coast because that's just a really They're developing different strains, whereas before, if you just bought it, you get whatever's on the market, but the price has stayed the same. So why can't these people continue to grow marijuana if the price is stabilized?
Yeah, that'd be great. I mean, and what Vicente Fox has said is like, in Sinaloa, where you've got people who've been growing marijuana for 100 years, why can't you just say, okay, you become great, Sinaloan marijuana can become a special kind of thing in the same way that tequila is an area which has a great industry in tequila.
There's a town called Tequila. I've been there. It's covered in agave plants. You can buy it in a barrel. It's fantastic.
Fantastic stuff. So the tequila town itself. So why can't people, you say, grow marijuana legally, create a legal market, bring people out of the shadows there, try and bring that section of the market outside, and deal with the horrific antisocial crime, the people who kidnap kids and chop their fingers off and send them to their parents.
That's an excellent point in that take the police force away from trying to enforce these ridiculous drug laws and instead put them on the people who are killing and kidnapping and whatnot, because that will free up an enormous amount of manpower and also the police budget.
Yeah, I want to ask you, what do the drugs lords that what do they think? Do they want it? Obviously, they don't. They don't want things.
They're probably wealthy enough. They're like, yeah, fuck it.
What's their view on legalization?
It's interesting. There's a guy called La Tuta, Servando Gomez, who's a major drug trafficker. He's got a $5 million price on his head in the United States, and he releases videos of himself giving various rants where he has behind him a bunch of
YouTube.
On YouTube, fantastic. You can see this YouTube if you look up Servando Gomez. He was in fact a trained school teacher in a rural area, funny enough. He has a bunch of guys behind him with RPG-7 grenade launchers and rifles and stuff, and he's talking. And among his conversations, he said, well, look, I'm selling marijuana. Marijuana should be illegal. Sorry, marijuana should be legal. Marijuana should be legalized. So he's saying, no, it's crazy. I'm only selling this stuff because, I'm providing a service. So he justifies...
this is the exact same argument that was made by the opium warlord Kun Sa in the Southeast Asia. He was, they basically sent reporters out there, and he had an army of 30,000 people moving heroin across the border into Thailand and off, the Vietnam War and all through that, and that was the source of most of the heroin in New York and Europe. And he was basically like, look, there's a market out there. If I don't fill it, someone else will, and I treat my people way better than the Burmese military.
Yeah, I mean, and that's, again, I've heard this many times by different people in the drug trade. Just say, look, this stuff should be legal, so we're not doing anything wrong to justify their actions. And obviously, as you say, it's not in their interests for it to be legalized because that would take away their business. But again, their discourse is always that. But again, I'll go back to the points of what we should do and how we can deal with this issue. Apart from legalizing drugs and ending the war on drugs, and which we talked about, there still needs to be massive work done in these ghettos, in these poor communities across Latin America and around the world. And one of the kind of side effects of the last 20, 30 years of economic policies has been the creations of many communities which are kind of urbanized and marginalized, which are really cut off, and that these criminal warlords become a powerful presence in them. And we have to see this as a real issue. I remember seeing the film Elysium recently. I thought it was quite an interesting image there of, the world in the future of these just big ghettos everywhere, and then the rich just going up and living in places in space.
Well, they're already doing it. They're living in outer space right now.
Yeah. So but already, sometimes you get that. And recently I was in Jamaica, going around the ghettos in Kingston and seeing the violence there. And I always travel around, going to ghettos in Colombia, Venezuela, and you see this crazy pockets of poverty and violence living, and then wealth and stuff. These two worlds existing around, and it's a very sad where our society has gone. And there's some people who've got interesting ideas about how we can transform and break away these ghettos. There's a guy who was the mayor of Medellin called Fajardo, his surname was, who had this idea that you had to he was a mathematician, and he said, it's like a mathematical problem. How do we solve this issue of ghettoization? So we have to build the most beautiful buildings in the poorest areas. We have to do that. So we built a musical conservatory in the ghetto and cable cars, because a lot of them in the mountains, beautiful cable cars going up and taking them down. And it did help to try and revive, some things and reduce the murder rate there by putting money into these communities. We really have to think about very positive ways of transforming them and stopping the emergence of these ghettos and marginalization in Europe and the United States. I mean, again, there's pockets of poverty and bad things there as well that have to be dealt with.
Hello, this is Gary Bushell, and I'd like to invite you to try my new show here on Litopia, entitled, somewhat functionally, I think, The Gary Bushell Talk Show. As you may infer from the title, it's a show where people talk to me. But that really doesn't begin to do it justice. My guests are household names from entertainment, politics, the arts and sciences. You'll recognise the names, but you've never heard them talk like they do on my show, exposing big ideas, revealing even bigger secrets. Uncensored conversation, no spin, no bull. Straight from the heart, direct to you. Join me, The Gary Bushell Talk Show. It does what it says.
I want to talk about Kiki Camarena. Kiki Camarena was a DEA agent in the mid-'80s, and he basically figured out the whole sort of Iran-Contra scam. And to put it, there was always a sort of it was almost conspiracy theory back in the 80s and 90s that the U.S., specifically the CIA, were flying cargo planes down to places like Colombia, loading them up with cocaine, flying them down onto U.S. Air Force bases, flashing the CIA badge saying, no, you can't look in here, and then distributing that cocaine, selling it to the inner cities. That's when the crack epidemic broke out, and then filling those up with military hardware and shipping them down to support the Contras in Honduras. So this was all kind of rumored to be true, but what's happening now is some former DEA agents and some pilots who are actually involved in this kind of Air America smuggling are starting to come out and say, yeah, that was a while ago, and but that definitely happened. And this guy, Enrique Quique Camarena, he was essentially killed by the drug lord Rafael Cara Quintero. It was later estimated that he was tortured for 3 days. Now, Phil Jordan, the former head of the El Paso DEA, had this to say: we're not saying the CIA murdered Kiki Camarena, but the consensual relationship between the godfathers of Mexico and the CIA that included drug trafficking contributed to Camarena's death. So, and he also says, I don't know of any DEA administrator that I worked for who would have sanctioned cocaine smuggling into the United States in the name of national security when we are out there risking their lives. So basically, the CIA is smuggling the cocaine. The DEA has no idea what's going on. Kiki Camarena is out there as an undercover officer risking his life, and he found out about it. He told his superiors, and they basically allowed this crazy dude, Rafael Quintero, to kill him, although some of the Mexican press are saying that it was actually the CIA themselves. And one of the pilots, Robert Tosh Plumley, estimated that they shipped 40 million tons of cocaine into the United States. So you want us to trust our government. So this is all my sort of roundabout way of asking you, Ioan, is... Rafael Cara Quintero was released in July after serving, I think, 28 years of a 40-year sentence. He was released in Mexico, and the U.S. Has just put a $5 million bounty on his head if they bring him and try him in the United States. How do you feel about this whole affair?
There's still a lot of murky details to emerge from the whole case.
You are following this case.
Yeah, of course. And there's still a lot of murky details emerging and so forth. What I can say about the specifically about the CIA connections to cocaine trafficking is that was already proven anyway. After the a bit later, or in quite a similar time with the 80s, there was also cocaine being bought from some Nicaraguans who were involved in the Contras against the Sandinista government. And this again gets into this whole Iran-Contra thing. Now, there was a case proven by a journalist called Gary Webb who really looked at this and had this famous series, The Dark Alliance, where he already
That's right. Gary Webb wrote The Dark Alliance and he for the San Jose Mercury News, and he put out a series and saying, look, hey, the CIA is complicit in bringing cocaine into the country, and then they basically shut him down, drove him out, he went crazy and shot himself.
Exactly. But if you really look now, when the CIA kind of did their own investigation into these claims, and if you look at that report very carefully, they concede it was done. I mean, they concede. I mean, people discredit the argument by rephrasing what he's arguing and then saying, he's claiming the CIA were on the corner selling crack, which he's not claiming, and then discrediting that. What he very clearly claimed is the CIA was working with people who trafficked cocaine.
Yeah, there was independent contractors, so they could always just kind of wash their hands and go, we never knew these guys.
Yeah, they worked with some people. Those people were selling cocaine, and that money was going to fund the Contras, who were often training at that time in Honduras and then going over the border into Nicaragua and fighting that war. So I think those connections already. Now, if you look again at the CIA, the way they did their internal investigation, they conceded this stuff and then kind of buried it and hounded it and managed to get it out in the media, so people still kind of discredited him and still say, oh, it's been discredited. If you look at what is very clearly credited, that they concede these details. They concede they work with these people. Those people were selling cocaine. So I think that's been very clearly
and yet
proved.
Nobody picks it up. It just kind of gets swept under the rug. It's kind of like the yellow cake uranium that was the pretext for us launching the Iraq war. Like, we shipped some cocaine, we hired some people, we filled planes with guns and drugs and to fund our little wars against communism. But that's all in the past. You should go shopping and not worry about it, because we've got it all under control.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a lot of problems there. I mean, again, this is history, although it's still history in the making because of Carlos Quintero being released now. Supposedly, or one of the theories is he was taken out of prison because he's still a very influential figure in Sinaloa. He's from Sinaloa himself.
He's part of the Sinaloan cartel?
Yeah, he's part of, before it had different names, the Sinaloan cartel.
I realize there's tons of different factions, but
we call it the Guadalajara cartel, but basically it's a bunch of traffickers from Sinaloa who really got these links going back decades, or this 100-year history in these certain communities, and Carlos Quintero was massively part of that. I mean, I've been to towns where he was from up in the mountains there and seen the place where, in fact, they already had they already made one grave apparently waiting for him. He hasn't died yet. They already built this big kind of mausoleum he already made in his village there waiting for him. But anyway, he's still a very influential figure, and one of the theories is here is that he was released from prison on a technicality when the federal government didn't know about it, supposedly, but released from prison so that he could go to Sinaloa and kind of help broker peace between these different traffickers there who are still on the rampage.
Well, there we have it, folks. That brings us to the end of our show. That's a fascinating topic by a fascinating individual who's risked life and limb to bring us his book and his reporting on the Mexican drugs trade. You can find his book El Narco Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency. It was a fascinating read, taking you all the way from drugs production up the noses of rich college kids in Kennebunkport, Maine, and it's just an extraordinary tale full of violence and human drama, and we didn't even touch on the songs and the cult of Santa Muerte and the religious iconography. It's a fascinating topic, a fascinating book. You are a very brave individual, and we're very grateful to have you on the show. Ioan, how can we find you on the web?
I have a website, which is www.ioangrillo.com, which is IOANGRILLO. And you can see my website there with all the details about the book and so forth, and my email and Twitter and so forth. And yeah, it's great to be on the show. I'm working on a new book right now, looking at broader picture across Latin America, also visiting countries like Jamaica and Brazil and looking at those stories as well. And so it'd be great to be here in a couple of years with some new stories about those countries and about and hopefully they're talking about a more optimistic picture of the collapse of the war on drugs.
Ioan, thank you very much. You're listening to Litopia After Dark. It's been real. And remember, next time you light up, where is it coming from? Good night.